Hello, I'm Jorge Gestoso. Welcome to a new program from Washington. The World Trade Organization was created almost 20 years ago to regulate trade among the countries of the world. But how fair is the free trade that the developed countries are trying to implement? In order to put in perspective the subject, our guest today, Deborah James, Director of International Programs of the CEPR. Deborah James, a warm welcome to the program.
Thank you so much for having me.
Tell us what WTO is about.
The World Trade Organization is an institution that now has 160 members of countries around the world that intends to regulate the global trade. It was founded in 1995, and it is the fruit of many years of negotiations. It has a predecessor, actually, which was called the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, that was founded by basically the winners of World War II. The rich countries, after World War II, set up an institution for them to do progressive liberalization, which means the reduction of tariffs on cross-border trade. And it was really just amongst the rich countries that were the non-communist rich countries at that time. And they engaged in a number of negotiations to further liberalize trade, further reduce their tariffs on trade and goods. And this produced a great advantage for them, and it disadvantaged quite a number of countries, most of the developing countries of the world, actually. And through the years, there was an effort to have a global institution that not only addressed trade in goods, which is what the GATT, the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, did, but also looked at trade in agriculture. And this had to do with the fact that most developing countries actually had comparative advantage in agriculture and were sort of getting left out of this new system. And so after many years of negotiations that were also at the behest of a lot of corporations that wanted to have new sets of rules on issues like trade and services, intellectual property, and other technical barriers to trade, there was a whole set of institutions that was developed. And instead of just being one tariff agreement that was actually under the United Nations, they developed a new system that has more than 17 different agreements under it that includes trade in goods, but also trade in agriculture and trade in services, intellectual property, and a whole slew of other issues, as well as a dispute settlement mechanism, which was a new part. And that became the end of the Uruguay Round agreements and the founding of the WTO in 1995.
You have said financial services are out of control. Are also, you have said, the corporations by the government that is behind your back. Tell us about that. How much influence corporations have running the show, if you want, of the WTO?
Well, it's interesting. It's actually that the corporations are the ones that come up with the ideas first. So instead of thinking about governments sort of doing financial impact assessments or economic assessments to figure out things that you and I would think that they would do, like how can we create jobs, or how can we preserve our environment, or how can we guarantee public services, what happens in trade negotiations is that the national trade associations, so in the case of services, for example, it would be the U.S. Coalition of Services Industries, tries to figure out ways that it can make more money by opening more market access in other countries, okay? And then they come up with proposals for deregulation, for increased liberalization of trade in their area, and they actually bring those proposals to the U.S. Trade Representative here in Washington, and then the U.S. Trade Representative adopts that as the U.S. trade position without even necessarily consulting hardly any of the other interest groups that might care about that issue, and then global trade negotiations might start on that issue. And so that is, for example, how we have the agreement in agriculture was actually written by a number of people who work for some of the big global agriculture corporations like Monsanto. And sometimes they actually go into government for a little while, get a position in the U.S. Trade Representative, write the agreements because they know what their corporation wants, and then they go through the revolving door and get hired back by the corporation afterwards.
So how all this affect Latin America?
Well, Latin America has been a very big player in the WTO for certainly recently. Historically, it was, as I said, one of the main demandeurs of having a different system than the WTO, advocating for what was called an international trade organization that really took into account the needs of Latin America, and particularly the agricultural production. But since the founding of the WTO, there was a new round of negotiations launched. Okay, just to give a little bit of background here. In 1995, the WTO was founded, and in 2001, they were successful in being able to launch a new round of negotiations. Okay, so that means more liberalization, more market access, more issues coming into the fold of the WTO. And that's what the rich countries wanted. But at the time, that's not what the developing countries, including Latin America, that's not what they were demanding. What they were demanding was reforms to agriculture as a central plank, and also a whole series of changes around development issues that had to do with the inequalities and asymmetries of the existing WTO that came into existence in '95. And so they had a whole series of over 100 demands, okay? And since then, at the beginning of that time, what we saw was that there was still what was called the Quad, was kind of, in charge of deciding everything. So we had the US, we had the EU, we had Canada, we had Japan, sometimes there was Australia. And at that time, you really saw, what they decided, the developing countries, boy, they really just got rolled over a lot of times. It was like, okay, well, we'll take into account your development demands, but then they start negotiating on everything else they want to negotiate on, right? Which was more market access in services and in goods. And so what's really changed fundamentally is the role of certain developing countries in the WTO. And this has been a big shift.
For example, which ones?
For example, well, Brazil is the one that's, it's unprecedented change in role over time. It was really noticeable, I would say, probably in the 2005 Hong Kong ministerial, where you really saw Brazil take a leading role in convening developing countries. As you know, developing countries are not a unified bloc. They don't all have the same issues, they don't all have the same aspirations, they don't all have the same politics. And so it's a lot harder to come up with just a one position that is what the developing countries want. But Brazil was successful in doing this and bringing together the sort of emerging market developing countries with the least developed countries across multiple regions from Asia, Africa, Latin America, and bringing them together and creating more of a unified demand. And this tended to upend things. Then we got to 2008, where there was a big clash, and it was sort of like, the US and EU saying we have to get more market access in what we want, and Brazil and India standing up and saying, no, we're not going to, accept this anymore. And that's when you saw the Doha negotiations, sort of fall apart and start to stagnate.
You were writing an article that was having as a title, Cuba, on behalf of the ALBA country group, blocks World Trade Organization talks.
Yes. Well, it has happened a number of times, actually. There has been the emergence of, I should mention some other countries, particularly Argentina has been extremely vocal, calling for some changes, and particularly on protecting its domestic manufacturing production. They've been the most outspoken on that issue, I would say. But particularly this group of progressive countries in Latin America, so looking at Venezuela, Ecuador, Cuba, they kind of have a coalition. And it was even necessarily before the ALBA bloc, the Bolivarian Alliance for Our Americas, came into existence necessarily, but they started making alternative proposals and saying, this thing that the US is demanding of us isn't actually in our national interests, where you see some other Latin American countries, I can name names, Costa Rica, Colombia, Peru, unfortunately, Mexico, Chile, that oftentimes sort of echo whatever the proposal of the United States is, and they'll often join agreements that are just the rich countries, and then you'll see those Latin American countries joining it. And instead, with these other countries, with Ecuador, Venezuela, Cuba, you see them on a fairly regular basis, Bolivia, excuse me for not mentioning Bolivia, standing up and really saying, wait a second, people, this is not the right model. This is a model of a trade agreement that benefits corporations. This is not what our people need.
This is not free trade.
And it's not even free trade, that's right. It's completely hypocritical. It's just protecting the interests of the rich corporations in the north. And a government like Bolivia or Ecuador or Venezuela is like, that's not what we were elected for. And so their representatives in Geneva have a very different perspective. And they're constantly bringing up these issues about the fact that there is a global climate crisis, and the WTO is actually hindering efforts to resolve the global climate crisis. Or there's a food crisis, and there's no solution on site in the WTO for the global food crisis, even though it's actually exacerbating that same crisis. And particularly with the financial crisis, as you mentioned earlier, the financial crisis, the WTO has a separate understanding on financial services that codifies and congeals financial services deregulation, okay, and liberalization, that really helps set the stage, because the World Trade Organization, it sets the rules by which all countries have to operate. So it really set the stage for that liberalization and deregulation that allowed the global financial crisis to happen. Within the WTO, there's been almost no recognition of that fact. And in fact, countries like the United States and Europe and many others are pushing for even further deregulation of global finance through a new trade and services agreement that they're promoting. Ecuador, on the other hand, and we know that President Correa has been a leader in implementing financial reform in his own country, and they have had a vision of taking a look at some of the financial services deregulation in the WTO and saying, no, this is not what we need. We don't need just more rules that prohibit national governments from making rules to discipline finance. We actually need that policy space to discipline global finance. And, it's been blocked by the United States time and time again.
BRICS could play a role in all this?
The BRICS, I think, are playing somewhat of a role. They certainly do in terms of the fact that they're the countries that go to the G20. And the US and EU have attempted several times to use the G20 to impose a sort of like direction for where the WTO was going to go, knowing that they just, it's mostly the rich and a few of their invited club members. And the BRICS have actually been pretty good at standing up to that and saying, no, we're not here to just be told what is our marching orders. We have a different vision in mind, and we're going to go back and be more in alliance with our developing countries and not just, allow the rich countries to use the G20 as a way to implement their own vision.
That situation is really increasing disparity, inequality?
Absolutely. I think that we have seen the results of the last 20 years of the World Trade Organization they're in. And what it has done has presided over an era where there has been obviously some growth and development. We've seen that across Latin America. We've seen it in many countries in Asia, maybe less in Africa, but there is some. But what we've also seen is an era of increased inequality. And I think that when we look at the era, certainly in countries like Latin America, it's actually some of their growth has been going against the type of rules that the World Trade Organization is promoting. It's not because of the facilitation of the World Trade Organization rules. I mean, take an issue like jobs, okay? So we have an agreement that in the WTO, countries are bound not to raise their tariffs over a certain level, whatever level they've committed to in the WTO. Now, if a country wants to create jobs, they use tariffs strategically to support certain industries, right, infant industries, to help bring up those industries and until they get to a point where they're competitive. And then they say, okay, we're going to liberalize and we're going to move the tariffs down. That's what all the rich countries did. For example, that's what we're trying to do with developing clean energy in the United States. We want to invest in some of those green tech industries, okay? These type of subsidies are not allowed in the WTO in general. And if you want to have a job creation program, you don't fundamentally follow the rules of the WTO, which say you should just liberalize, you should reduce your barriers to trade. That's not a job creation program. And what normal people want is to see their country have an industrial policy, have a policy that can create jobs and not just adhere to the standards of an international organization based in Geneva, where the rules were set by global corporations of the rich countries.
And also there's an issue that you bring to the attention of the people is the U.S. subsidize the agricultural production, and that's fine, but they do not allow, for example, India to subsidize food for food security of their own people.
So we have a country like India, okay, that has over 1 billion people, and over half the country is involved in agricultural production, and for the vast majority of them, they're very poor. They have very, very small plots of land. And so the government has, over many years, developed a program to promote food security. And this has been at the demand of a very large civil society movement also that's demanding not only that people are given a small subsidy of food, that the poor, be they urban or rural, be given a small subsidy of food, but that also that food is actually done through government procurement by the national population, so that they're actually buying food from the poorest farmers, okay, to help raise their income as well. So you want to actually reduce poverty on both sides of the equation, right? You want to reduce it where the food is being produced, and you want to reduce the poverty where the food is being consumed. In the United States, our food subsidy program, we subsidize the farmers, okay, but then we also give vouchers to people to go out and buy food in the open market, okay? So that, the voucher program is actually, it's not against the WTO rules, the food stamps that we have, the SNAP program. But India's program is against the rules. Why? Because when the US corporations wrote the rules, they wrote it to be accommodating to the US program, okay? And India at that time didn't have the money to subsidize.
Sort of a double standard.
So it's a complete double standard, and India has been raising this. And what is interesting, Jorge, is that around the entire world, if you look at any other place where agriculture is discussed, like in the Food and Agriculture Organization or the World Committee on Food Security, they all recognize that one of the #1 things that needs to happen to reduce poverty, hunger, malnourishment, food insecurity around the world is for developing countries to invest in agriculture. And what the whole world is not talking about then is the fact that the WTO rules constrain those same developing countries for doing it. And India has been valiantly trying to raise this in the WTO. They have a coalition of over 46 countries that's supporting them. It's not just India trying to do this, right? There's a lot of countries in Africa and Asia and other countries. And the US has almost unilaterally opposed this all last year. It came to a head in the ministerial last year, and the US finally agreed on what's called a peace clause. They said, okay, we won't bring a lawsuit against you in the WTO for these subsidies, but you have to give us this and this and this and this. That's binding, that's bad for developing countries on trade facilitation, which we can talk about, only to have a reprieve of 4 years. And this, for the new government in India, has not been enough. For the farmers of the world, it's not enough. For people who demand food security around the world, it's not enough. We need a total transformation of the rules so that food security is at the center of the rules instead of just global corporations making more money trading in food.
That's exactly what I was on my way to comment to, because regarding intellectual property or patents.
Patents, yeah.
You said the U.S. is incredibly protectionist on this issue. Patents are a huge impediment to free trade.
Patents and copyright and trademarks are some of the biggest distorters of trade in terms of the fact that they add on costs that are not actually about the production and distribution of the good.
And then you say that's a way to transfer funds from the south to the north, from consumers to corporations.
Absolutely, absolutely. So in the United States, we have this ideology that we need to have patents, for example, on medicines, okay, in order to spur innovation. There are other ways of spurring innovation in medicine other than patents, okay? For example, we have a National Institute of Health here that does a lot of the innovation on patents here in Washington by handing out all kinds of grants to companies to spur this innovation. So a lot of times when companies get a patent or a copyright, they have used public funds in order to do that, right? So, you know, you look at something even like the development of the internet, of course, which was not done by private corporations as much as it was done, you know, spurred on by US government and military money. So we have all these goods that are actually public that are then private, the profit of them is privatized. And what the US has done then is take this to such an extreme, and this has to do specifically with the power of the pharmaceutical lobby in the United States, okay? That has a power that is far more enormous than the actual benefit it brings to our economy, okay? So it has imposed such an extremist, protectionist regime that says that patents need to be in effect for 20 years into the future, okay? Not just a few years enough to recoup the investment or to spur innovation. There's no economic model that shows that we need to have a 20-year patent regime. There's no economics behind it. It's purely what in economics we call rent-seeking behavior. So they own the patents, and they are able to intervene into the political system to then get the US trade representative to advocate to implement this on a global level. And so they keep pushing it, and they are going to be making more and more money, which they can hire more lobbyists here in Washington, and they can get more laws passed in their favor and then impose those laws around the world through the WTO and through other regional trade agreements and free trade agreements like the Trans-Pacific Partnership.
Talk to me about the TFA.
The Trade Facilitation Agreement, the TFA, is actually the first actual trade agreement that the members of the WTO have negotiated since its launch in '95. So I mentioned earlier that the members of the WTO agreed in 2001 to launch a new round, okay? So there's already all these agreements. WTO already disciplines governments' trading behavior, has all these rules by which governments must obey, but rich countries want more market access, and the poorer countries wanted to actually change the existing rules to make them more fair. And what we ended up with after all these years through various machinations, which I've written about, is an agreement last December, which was at a ministerial that they had, the Bali ministerial, to have a new agreement that is called the Trade Facilitation Agreement. Okay, and they also agreed, as I mentioned, on a moratorium on bringing up cases around food security for certain countries in certain cases. The Trade Facilitation Agreement is purely a demand of the developed countries. Okay, there's no developing countries that have been advocating for a trade facilitation agreement.
Quite the contrary.
On the contrary, it's something that they absolutely opposed for a number of years. But what we have then is what trade facilitation agreement is. It puts binding rules on the procedures for customs and port operations. Okay, so there are now rules that say how long you can have a shipment in port before it has to be distributed, how mechanized in terms of the computer resources, you know, that it can't be just a whole bunch of pieces of paper, it has to be on a computer. There's all these different rules. And so the way that that happened is that the global logistics corporations, so all the corporations that are involved in global shipping and transport and trade, they decided, well, we could make a lot more money if we didn't have to deal with all these government rules and fees and things like that to have border, you know, it's not only a border tariff, but to say, well, it costs you X number of dollars to process because our customs people have to be paid and such. And so they got together and made this idea for an agreement on trade facilitation. And this is now an agreement. At the time of December, they also agreed that they gave themselves 6 months to decide how to implement the agreement, what was going to be the mechanism for implementation. Okay, so you can agree on the piece of paper, but it doesn't come into existence in that minute. You have to agree on a protocol of implementation. Well, India came back, and this is an amazing story. India came back and said, you know what? You guys, ever since December, have now refused to negotiate on my food security proposal, which affects the lives of 800 million people in my country. But instead, you have spent all this time trying to figure out the protocol of implementation of something called the Trade Facilitation Agreement, which nobody at the base level cares about. I mean, there's no one person in any country that's not involved in this that says, oh, what I really need to develop is a Trade Facilitation Agreement. I mean, nobody cares about this, right? And so they said, we're not going to agree to your protocol until you take seriously our issue on food security. And
basic thing.
It fell apart. And that deadline just passed on July 31st. The WTO hasn't reconvened since then. And so at this moment, it's not clear because their mandate for negotiations has expired.
And you think that most definitely to help the situation, a tax on financial speculation should be implemented?
Oh, well, at the Center for Economic and Policy Research, we are big advocates of a financial speculation tax, a financial transaction tax. It's something that, you know, would absolutely help to discipline finance and provide a global good of a whole bunch of extra money that we need for things like climate change, global development, for mitigation funds for countries undergoing financial crisis, education, everything. We are absolutely in favor of that. It's something that certainly is not talked about in the World Trade Organization at all because, again, the goal of the WTO is to liberalize finance, so to take off these barriers in trade in goods and agriculture. However, it's important to understand that at the same time it imposes a whole slew of new rules, so it's not free trade at all because you have all these disciplines prohibiting national governments from implementing regulations on services to oversee public services or discipline private services, and the intellectual property rules.
What will be the next step? What we can expect?
Well, in the WTO, it's going to open up again. You know, they start negotiations in September, so we'll see where they go with the Trade Facilitation Agreement. It's not clear what's going to happen. We are going to see a big fight on the food security because it is something that is unconscionable at this point that we still have a WTO which limits the amount of investment in food security that developing countries can do. And then we're going to see again, a ramping up of the other trade agreements where corporations have basically said, you know, we're not getting what we want out of the WTO, and so we're going to have, you know, they haven't gotten the further liberalization of services, so they're trying to create a trade and services agreement that's separate. They're trying to create new agreements on environmental goods. They're working to create new agreements on information technology and goods so that they can get their agreements on goods for further liberalization in goods and services done without having to give in to the demands of the developing countries on agriculture and development. And that's going to be a big fight that we're going to see for many years to come, I think.
Deborah James, thank you.
Thank you so much.